Progesterone support, progesterone support. It causes gross discharge and your boobs are sore. The timing is important after ovulation. Let's talk about progesterone support. Do you know it?
Is that a Mickey Mouse song?
No, it's Cruella de Vil. Really?
Oh, God. I don't know. Welcome to The Whole Pineapple. I'm Ruby Boris.
And I'm Ann Judge. The Whole Pineapple is a podcast about wellness focused around fertility. And on these weekly mini episodes, we bring you bite-sized ideas for you to snack on.
Like breathing exercises, book reviews. Maybe we'll review some scientific research, or we'll share some wellness and fertility stories from our listeners.
So if you're looking for a tip or a trick related to your fertility and well-being, then you've come to the right place.
Let's dig in.
Well, welcome back to The Whole Pineapple, short snack edition. I'm Ann Judge.
I'm Ruby Boris.
And I hope that everybody listened to our earlier episode in our kind of education short snack series where we talked about ovulation predictor kits, and from that, what's happening in kind of the first early half of your cycle, which is your body potentially preparing to ovulate. What does it mean to have an LH surge? And so now today, we're going to go into the luteal phase. What happens post-ovulation?
Yeah, so the second half of the cycle. And so, yes, this episode is in reference to people with ovaries and who ovulate. But as we had mentioned in the Ovulation Predictor Kit episode, we all have these types of hormones floating around in our bodies, just in different amounts and different timings and things like that. So certainly you might have heard some of the hormones we've thrown out, like follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, estrogen, testosterone, things like that, because those with testicles do have follicle stimulating hormone. Those with ovaries do have testosterone. So there is some overlap.
Mm-hmm. So when we talk about progesterone in the luteal phase, it is important to remember for first episode and this episode, we have to think about everything together. We're thinking about the signals your brain is sending. We're thinking about your ovaries and what they're doing for ovulation. But meanwhile, your uterus is doing a lot too. And so I don't know if we covered this as much in the OPK episode, but the whole time that your ovary is preparing for that egg and the estrogen is rising, that increased estrogen is also what's getting your uterine lining increasingly thick, because you've got to have this like nice, thick, fluffy like carpet for that embryo to like burrow into and really try and
it's
grab
nice and
hold.
Fluffy. It's like shag. It's like the 70s shag carpet.
Where there's like they can just like grab on. And when you look at like photos of what an actual like trophoblast embryo with these little like the syncytiotrophoblasts, these little
so
like
cool
projections that are literally like binding into the uterus. I mean, it's a pretty crazy process that has to happen for everything to line up and for you to have implantation. And so to get that uterus adequately prepared, you have to have that nice base of estrogen, and then you have to have exposure to progesterone.
And that changes how the endometrium or the lining of the uterus looks and responds. So it's preparing that uterus for implantation. So estrogen gets it nice and thick, and progesterone gets the signal ready to make it a nice, lovely little comfortable home.
In one of my classes, I don't know if I'm going to explain it quite right, but they talk about, it's almost like if you think about you're taking care of your lawn and like as the grass is growing.
Analogy.
Oh, well, you can tell it too, but you don't want it to be all overgrown. You want to kind of have that nice smooth trim that you go over the top and
the golf course.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's why if you're not having regular ovulation patterns and you're not having that cyclic, the estrogen buildup and then the progesterone buildup, that's why the lining can be unstable. And that's why you can have what we call irregular bleeding, where maybe you just have some bleeding every couple weeks, but it's not what seems like a true period and you're not sure if you're ovulating. And again, your uterus and your ovaries are trying to talk to each other, but they're not doing it in that like balanced, efficient pattern. And that's why you're not having this like optimal cycle in terms of timing up ovulation with when the uterus is ready. And that's what's so important about that progesterone. That progesterone exposure is what prepares the lining of the uterus, the endometrium, for implantation. And that's why it's so important in fertility treatments to know when that exposure to progesterone is happening, because we want to make sure that an embryo is going into the environment when it's ready for it.
Yes, certainly. Oftentimes we'll have patients that come to see us and they've been prescribed or recommended to take progesterone in their luteal phase or even throughout their cycle even, which I'm just like, no, that's like beyond the basic understanding of what the menstrual cycle is. But even if it is prescribed in the luteal phase, sometimes they're just told, just take it after ovulation. But there is such thing as taking progesterone too early or too late. There is a specific time that in a typical or textbook functioning body when that progesterone does rise. So it is possible to supplement too early or too late.
And that's part of the reason that you don't want someone to just be saying on day 14 every month start your progesterone, because every month can vary. And so you really do want to be making sure you know in that specific cycle, did you ovulate, when did you ovulate, and then how many days later you want to start that progesterone. Because just like you have that curve that's the LH surge, the LH surge is a real steep mountain. It's like this just quick, tsunami wave that comes up and goes down. And the progesterone is much more of a nice gradual hill mountain that kind of rises up and then is sort of staying up for that, whole time frame when it's waiting to see if that uterus is going to have an implantation, if you're going to have a pregnancy. And tell us, where does progesterone come from?
Yeah, so progesterone, after you ovulate, that place where you released your egg, so that follicle that grew and developed, you release the egg from that fluid-filled pocket. After the egg's released, it kind of collapses in on itself and becomes what's called the corpus luteum, or corpus lutea if you have ovulated more than one egg. And that corpus luteum is very important. It has its main job is to produce progesterone, which supports a potential pregnancy.
Exactly. So again, I always think of the uterus and the ovary kind of talking to each other. And so the ovary knows that it has released an egg, and so now it kind of folds back in on itself and it starts pumping out progesterone that it knows is going to help support and hopefully maintain an early pregnancy. And progesterone, it's what everyone thinks of as the hormone of pregnancy, is progesterone.
Yeah, and that's why if after ovulation you kind of experience some cramping pain on one or both sides of your ovaries, where your ovaries typically are, it might be that corpus luteum cyst that is producing progesterone. And we use the term cyst, but it's not abnormal. This is a very normal occurrence. This is what is supposed to happen in the cycle, but it can be kind of achy.
Yeah, and I think, again, this progesterone rise, this is just a normal part of what happens after ovulation. And so what a lot of people think of as classic early pregnancy symptoms, like sore breasts or fatigue, that's from progesterone. And that's what's so extra hard about fertility treatment.
It's so
is like
unfair.
We're giving everybody a ton of progesterone. So like I have never felt more pregnant in my life than one of my unsuccessful cycles. It was my hormone replacement cycle, and I was just on so much progesterone. I was like, oh my God, I'm sure it worked.
Seriously. So early pregnancy and right before your period, there's literally, you can't tell the difference between pregnancy and before your period. And it's so hard.
Exactly. So that's why we often tell people when you're in that dreaded 2-week wait, try to distract yourself. Like, don't be overanalyzing.
Self-care.
Don't be poking your boobs to see if they're more tender today than yesterday.
I am guilty of that. I'm like, left, right.
Yeah, I mean,
and you can't see us, but I'm totally feeling if I have breast tenderness right now.
It shows that you've got progesterone, but there's really not a way to know yet in terms of whether you have an actual implantation, an actual early pregnancy. That embryo actually implanting in the uterus, that's what then starts producing HCG, which is that pregnancy hormone. And that's what those home urine tests can measure. That's what we measure if we come to the clinic. And it's that feedback of the HCG going and the ovary now realizing, oh my gosh, there's HCG, like there's a pregnancy hormone. That means I've got to keep making progesterone. And so then that corpus luteum stays there and it keeps pumping out that progesterone for quite a long time until the actual pregnancy itself and placenta takes over. You have progesterone your entire pregnancy, but in that early stage, it's actually coming from that corpus luteum, that cyst that you're supposed to have on your ovary. And that's why you don't get a period, because there's that feedback of the ovary and the corpus luteum realize, I see HCG on board, I need to keep making this progesterone.
Right. So that corpus luteum, it can't last forever if it's not doesn't have that exposure to that communication with HCG. So if that communication is not there is not that signal from the uterus say like, hey, we have a pregnancy happening here, then the corpus luteum just doesn't have the energy to sustain that. And that is when it stops producing progesterone. And so that's what signals your body to have a period.
Yeah. The progesterone's dropped off. It's like, oh, okay, time to shut off that lining. And then we'll do it again again next month. And that's why if someone is trying to just have like a single progesterone level checked to confirm if they ovulate, you really have to do it in the right window of time. Because if you have someone that maybe has longer irregular cycles and you check a single progesterone on day 16 and they don't ovulate till day 18, well, you're going to get that low progesterone on day 16. It doesn't mean they might not actually be about to ovulate. Or similarly, if someone has kind of short cycles and you're checking a single level on day 22 and that progesterone is low, it doesn't necessarily mean they didn't ovulate that month. Maybe they ovulated so far in the past and now their progesterone is already about to drop and they're about to get their period on day 25. So you can't just make everybody do a day 21 progesterone blood draw. That's assuming that everybody is a textbook day 14 that ovulation happens. And that's just not how bodies work.
I think I've mentioned this before. Very few of us look and act like the textbooks. There's probably somebody out there that every cycle has exactly 28-day cycles and they never, ever vary from that. But,
and I talk to those people. Those people call me. They're like, I swear, I never have it. But then I have to explain, you're actually the outlier. Like, that's pretty exciting for you because many people, there's going to be kind of some month-to-month variability in that. So checking progesterone, it's always important to kind of think about where you're checking it. And that's the reason that when people are on fertility treatment, we're often having them take extra supplemental progesterone because it's so important for early implantation. And when we're doing something like an IVF cycle, your body is not naturally ovulating. Those ovaries don't form quite the same corpus luteum as they would if they were natural. We are kind of poking them to drain all that fluid out and get the eggs. And so we want to make sure that there's enough progesterone on board to be maintaining. And that's the reason that our fertility treatments are often involving progesterone supplementation, but in a very specific time to make sure that we're getting those windows correct.
Yes, and even some of the medications that we use themselves, even if you're not doing an IVF cycle, we sometimes use those similar IVF type of medications called follicle stimulating hormone. So it's just like that outside source of follicle stimulating hormone or gonadotropins, which stimulate your ovaries. And when we do that, in some cases, when we give that medication, it can interfere with your body's natural ability to produce progesterone sufficiently. So in those cycles, we do put people on luteal phase support or progesterone support in their luteal phase. Yeah,
basically now, the more that we've kind of manipulated the natural cycle, the more we've got to make sure in the back end that your body has all the hormones it needs.
Yeah, support. Now, I do get a lot of questions from people about progesterone supplementation in the luteal phase, whether it's needed or not, or that a big question is like, maybe do I have a progesterone insufficiency? Does my body maybe not produce the right level of progesterone?
Right. And there's so much buzz about this online and celebrity talk about it. I think it's interesting how many people will kind of be semi-open. They'll be like, I did fertility treatment. I had to give myself progesterone. It's like,
and PSA, IVF does not cause menopause. Okay.
Yeah.
PSA. Anyway, that was a side. Anywho.
So, your progesterone, when we want to check it, we want to check it. We don't just put people, some people do. Some people are like, hand out the progesterone like candy. But progesterone does have side effects. Again, you're going to have a lot of these symptoms. Some people, if you're using it orally, you can have some nausea. If you're using it vaginally, you're going to have discharge. If you're giving yourself an injectable medication, you really want to make sure you need it. And so we tend to only prescribe luteal phase progesterone if we think it's indicated because of the treatment plan that you're on, or if we've actually checked your levels post-ovulation and found out that they really are below average, because many times they're not, or many times if they've been low in the past because you weren't ovulating, if we get you to ovulate, then you're suddenly going to have a corpus luteum that's going to make that progesterone. Or especially, as Ruby mentioned, if you release 2 eggs, now you have 2 corpus luteum. So often, if you were only slightly low, the mere fact of doing fertility medications and maybe ovulating 2 eggs will often also boost your levels. So signs that someone might actually need extra support would be if you do consistently have a short luteal phase, not just short periods from period to period, because that might be a sign you're ovulated on the early side. But if you're tracking your ovulation and you aren't having anywhere close to that 2 weeks that it usually takes between ovulation and starting a period, or if you're always having a lot of irregular spotting in that luteal phase, then talk to your provider. That's a good reason to check and see. But I would say check rather than just starting progesterone, because again, you need to make sure you're using it appropriately if you want to really be enhancing your chance of getting pregnant as opposed to maybe making it less likely.
Yeah, because certainly there are cycles and instances and fertility issues that have like corpus lutea insufficiency or luteal phase defect or deficiency. There's lots of terms for it. So it does happen, but is it something that's a persistent issue for you or because you weren't ovulating regularly? That's a good discussion with your provider. The other reason that we might prescribe progesterone is for people that have recurrent pregnancy loss. And ultimately with that is in most cases, we don't actually know if it is a progesterone insufficiency, but in a lot of cases, we do prescribe progesterone for those that have a recurrent pregnancy loss, just because we want to do all the things to support a pregnancy that we can.
And I think that's part of the reason there is so much confusion about progesterone is that many people, if they have had potentially an early miscarriage and someone has checked their pregnancy hormone and it's falling or it's low, and they check a progesterone and it's low as well, that all fits together. If it's not an ongoing pregnancy where that HCG is doubling and doubling the way that it's expected to, the ovaries are noticing that too. That feedback is decreasing, and therefore the corpus luteum is resolving and the progesterone is dropping. And that's part of that, unfortunately, natural process of a pregnancy that has stopped developing, and therefore the progesterone is now low. It is not that having low progesterone caused a normal pregnancy to stop growing. But I think that's where a lot of people get confused. They might have had some past monitoring where they said my pregnancy level was dropping and that my progesterone was low, if only I'd been on extra progesterone. But that's not what those things mean. And I know that can be really confused and upsetting for people, because obviously you want to feel like you've done everything that you can to support a pregnancy. But early losses like that are primarily because the embryo itself was not developing normally. And that's why it stops at that early stage, and you have that drop off in both those hormones.
Yeah, that's a really good explanation for that, and it's something that I get questions on a lot. I would say it's one of the more common things that come up in a patient's first like initial interactions with the fertility clinic is, what's going on with my progesterone, because it is something that is talked about a lot. And it's actually not new. It's been decades that people have gone back and forth on how much we need to supplement and things like that. So we have learned things, but it certainly is something that is out there and talked about.
And that progesterone is important to protect your uterus in all these different ways. We're not getting into it right now with hormone replacement therapy and menopause and everything else, but your uterus needs that balance to decrease unexposed exposure to just estrogen, which will just cause the lining to build up and build up. And that's the exact reason that if someone comes to see us who hasn't been having cycles, especially if they haven't had a period in a while, we'll often induce a period with progesterone. And what we do there is kind of trick your body. We have you take like 7 to 10 days of a progesterone pill so that we're making everybody think that you've ovulated by having that rise in progesterone. And then when you finish that prescription and your progesterone drops off, now your body's going to sense that drop and it's going to get a period. So inducing with a progesterone will cause you to get a period, but it's not causing you to ovulate. And so if someone is having irregular cycles because they're not ovulating, taking regular progesterone will cause you to feel like your periods are normal, but it's not making your ovary actually release an egg. And so it's not actually helping you in your goal to get pregnant.
Yes, and it's basically simulating the second half of your cycle. So your body is not ovulating, so it's not doing that second half progesterone rise like it would if it had ovulated. And so what we do, we give you progesterone for that 7 to 10 days, your progesterone level rises, and then when you stop it, that's that crash in the progesterone that happens right before a period starts. I get a lot of people that they're in the middle of their progesterone course and they're like, why haven't I started my period? I've been taking this progesterone for 5 days. And it's really not while you're taking it that's going to cause the period. It is actually following taking the progesterone that will cause the period. And it can be up to 14 days before you start a period after you stop your progesterone. So wait a full 14 days before you say, well, it didn't work.
And sometimes people, like maybe you do start bleeding like when you have a day or two left. That's kind of a sign that your body was kind of already probably on its tail end and dropping anyway. It doesn't mean that anything's going wrong. So, that's how the luteal phase works. Obviously, it's super important. It's like half of the cycle.
Yeah, for sure.
But it is a source of common misperceptions. I think especially if people are doing a lot of online research, there's a lot of, I think, misinformation about how progesterone relates to everything else, because that's what's important. The timing for it is what's so critical.
Yes. Yeah, timing is super important. So if you feel like progesterone might be an issue, bring it up with your provider. It's a good discussion to have because everyone's an individual, and we would equate it with your testing and your situation and to see if progesterone support is something that you might need. And then we educate you on the specific timing of that particular medication because the timing is really crucial.
Perfect. Now
Okay,
everybody knows everything. That's it.
Then we covered, that is it. We are at the end of the menstrual cycle.
Yeah, and then it all starts again.
And then it all starts over again. Yeah. Wah, wah, wah. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's always fun to go back to our roots at the very foundation of our practice, that menstrual cycle. I just have that chart pictured in my head with the ups and the downs and the peaks, and then
both Ruby and I are talking with our hands and making curves this entire conversation.
The quick little LH and then the nice drawn out progesterone.
But it's a dance. Anyway. Like, it's this very delicate dance between your brain and your ovaries and your uterus, and everyone has to do their part for everything to swirl properly. So
and if the timing's not right, things can get thrown off. It just shows you how intricate this process is, and it really is amazing to me sometimes that people get pregnant at all. Which is, I know also frustrating for, those that are struggling to get pregnant. Like, well, some people, it doesn't seem to be an issue at all. But then you go through and realize how many steps there are. Yeah,
but now you know more than you did before. So keep on listening. Send us your questions too. We love hearing from people of something that you've been confused by. We love to break all this down. I think it's probably, and just for me, my favorite part of the job, and I think it's probably for you too, that these are complicated ideas, but once you understand them, then it makes sense, and then you understand so much more about why potentially you're having to do the things you have to do when it comes to fertility treatment.
It really is empowering to learn about your body and how it works and things like that. So yes, send us questions, send us your listener stories at thewholepineapple@gmail.com. Give us those 5-star ratings. It really does drive us up the charts. I always want to say leaderboard, but it's not leaderboard, up the charts. And that helps us to be visible and for other people to find us so they can be helped by this type of content as well.
All right. Have a delicious week.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of the Whole Pineapple Podcast. We hope it was helpful.
If you know someone who could benefit from hearing the podcast, we hope you'll share it with them.
And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the Whole Pineapple on your favorite podcast app. Every rating and review makes us easier to find.
This podcast is sponsored by Seattle Reproductive Medicine and is produced by Audiotocracy Podcast Production. We'll see you next time. Have a delicious week.